The fluorescent lights of the Houston Convention Center hummed their mechanical song as Hannah Clarke stood at the back row, watching her son graduate. 16 hours on her feet at Sacred Heart had left her scrubs wrinkled, still carrying that faint copper and antiseptic smell that never quite washed out. She hadn't gone home to change. Hadn't even sat down since the morning shift ended. Her son Jacob was graduating in 90 seconds, and she would not miss it, not for a dress code, not for anyone. The auditorium was crowded. Families in tailored suits and pressed dresses filled the center sections, cameras ready, phones out, the excited chatter of 1,000 conversations echoing off the high ceiling. Somewhere in that crowd of privilege and formal attire, Hannah stood in her work clothes, her scrubs the color of dried sage, her white shoes scuffed from 12-hour shifts in trauma bays where people bled out on linoleum. She gripped the back of the empty seat in front of her, steadying herself. Her hands were steady now. They had to be. Inside her jacket lining, pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat, was the faded unit patch. A Navy SEAL trident, worn nearly transparent from 18 years of being hidden. Tikrit. That was the last time she'd worn it openly, the last time anyone called her by her rank. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. Now she was just Hannah, the nurse in the wrinkled scrubs, the woman who kept her hands moving and her mouth shut. She'd overheard the parking lot conversation 30 minutes earlier. Had walked past Dr. Marcus Sterling's black Mercedes while he stood talking to another man, the school board treasurer. She'd learned from his loud voice and louder laugh. Sterling's words had been clipped, precise, the sound of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The vendor contracts are running $840,000 over budget. As long as the numbers don't surface until after the audit cycle. The rest had been swallowed by the closing of Sterling's car door. But Hannah had heard enough. Had filed it away in the part of her brain that still operated like military intelligence gathering, even though she'd spent the last 3 years trying to forget how to notice things like fraud and corruption. Sterling moved through the crowd now, checking his phone, his expensive suit moving like water. He was a tall man, mid-50s, with the kind of face that belonged in board meetings and country clubs. Ceremony director, that's what the program said. He had that look of institutional authority, the kind that came from knowing the right people, the kind that made security guards snap to attention. Then he saw her. His eye swept past Hannah once, then came back. Locked onto her scrubs. His jaw tightened visibly, and he stopped walking. For a moment, he just stared. She watched his face run through several expressions, surprise, then something that looked like recognition, then calculation. His hand went to his phone. He didn't make a call. He just looked at her. Really looked at her. And something in his posture changed. The confidence drained just slightly from his shoulders. He knew something. Or suspected something. Hannah's breathing remained even, controlled. The way she'd been trained. The way she'd lived for 3 years since Tikrit, since the operation that didn't exist, since her entire service record had been erased from the official records and buried somewhere in a Pentagon filing system that didn't acknowledge she'd ever worn a uniform. She was invisible. That had been the point. That had been the condition of her survival. Sterling's phone vibrated. He looked down, read something, and his jaw went harder. His eyes came back to her. Sharper this time. He started walking in her direction, moving with purpose. 2 security guards materialized beside him, the kind of men who weren't there a moment ago but suddenly were, trained men with the kind of posture that meant they'd served somewhere. Their radios crackled with static. One of them spoke into his collar, too quiet for Hannah to hear, but she caught the pattern. Security detail. He'd called them. He'd requested them. He'd decided something about her. Sterling approached with the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned. The men flanked him, professional and smooth. Up close, Hannah could see the tension in Sterling's face, the way his eyes kept flickering to her jacket, to the place where the patch was hidden. He couldn't see through the fabric. But something about her, the way she stood, the way her shoulders were positioned, the military straightness of her posture, had triggered something in him. Sterling said. His voice was loud enough to turn nearby heads. "We need to have a word about your attire." Hannah didn't answer immediately. She looked past Sterling, watching her son Jacob sit in his chair on the stage, his graduation gown pristine, his face searching the crowd for her. When his eyes found her in the back row, he smiled. He didn't notice Sterling. Didn't notice the guards. Didn't know what was happening. "It's a formal event," Sterling continued, and there was something different in his voice now, something that sounded less like policy enforcement and more like fear trying to disguise itself as authority. "We've had to maintain strict dress codes. Healthcare workers in uniform, they can be disruptive to the decorum." The word disruptive hung in the air like a poorly thrown punch. Hannah turned to face him then. Really face him. And she saw him register what he was looking at, not a tired nurse, but someone whose eyes had seen things he hadn't. Someone whose hands had performed emergency procedures under fire. Someone whose entire body carried the quiet authority of someone who'd made life and death decisions without hesitation. "My son is graduating in 60 seconds, Hannah said. Her voice was soft. That was the thing about military training, you didn't need to yell to make people listen. The quiet ones were always the most dangerous. "I just finished a 16-hour shift at Sacred Heart saving lives. I'm wearing my work clothes because I came straight from an ICU patient who needed me. I didn't have time to go home." Sterling's face was flushing now, a high color creeping up his neck. But it wasn't anger. It was something else. Panic, maybe. Or guilt. The kind of panic that came from realizing that someone you'd underestimated had just heard something they weren't supposed to hear. "That's not, the policy is quite clear," Sterling started, but his voice had lost its certainty. One of the guards shifted his weight slightly. He was looking at Hannah's scrubs more carefully now, at the way they fit her frame, at the muscle definition visible beneath the fabric. Hannah could see the moment he noticed her hands, the calloused palms, the scarred knuckles, the kind of hands that didn't come from nursing. Or rather, they came from a very specific kind of nursing. The kind that happened in combat zones. She reached up slowly and touched the inside of her jacket, just a small pressure where the patch was sewn. The trident. Her fingers found the edge of it through the fabric, and she let her hand rest there for a moment. Not pulling it out. Not revealing it. Just touching it. The way she had every single day for 3 years, the way it kept her tethered to who she'd been, the way it reminded her that she was still there, still real, still herself even though everyone official said she'd never existed. Sterling watched her hand move. His face went even paler. "I'm going to stay," Hannah said quietly. "My son is about to walk across that stage. And I'm going to be here to see it." The ceremony bell chimed. Once. Twice. 3 times. The lights dimmed slightly. On stage, the graduates began to stand. Music swelled, pomp and circumstance, processed through the speaker system, filling the auditorium with its processional weight. Sterling's hand gestured to the guards. A command without words. The guards stepped forward, their faces professional, their posture shifting into something more aggressive. Hannah's breathing remained perfectly steady. Her hand stayed at her sides. She didn't move. Didn't flinch. The patch under her jacket pressed against her ribs like a secret that refused to stay buried, like the 18 years she'd carried it weren't finished yet, like the story of who she was and what she'd done was only just beginning to surface. Sterling thought he was in control. Sterling thought he held the authority here, in this auditorium full of families and camera flashes and the smell of expensive perfume mixing with fear. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling had no idea that the woman he was about to have removed from her son's graduation was someone who'd once held the line against an enemy assault with nothing but a trauma kit and a knife. Someone whose file didn't exist anymore because the Pentagon had decided her operation never happened. Someone whose real name was barely whispered in classified briefings that she would never be allowed to hear. The guard's hands came up. Sterling's mouth opened. And the auditorium went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Healthcare workers in uniform disrupting the decorum. That's what Dr. Sterling said, his voice cutting through the auditorium like a blade through silk. He stood directly in front of Hannah Clarke, blocking her view of the stage where her son Jacob waited in his cap and gown, and Sterling's words were loud enough to turn 3 rows of heads. This is a formal event celebrating academic excellence. We can't have you looking like you just walked off a night shift. His eyes dragged across her scrubs, the faded blue cotton still carrying the faint smell of antiseptic and something darker, something like copper, from the ICU where she'd spent the last 16 hours. The words landed like stones. Around her, parents shifted. A woman 2 seats over pulled her daughter closer. A man in the row behind whispered something to his wife, both of them staring. Hannah took one measured breath. Just one. The kind of breath a person takes when they're counting: 1, hold, 2. A single tear formed in her left eye. Not from shame. From the weight of it. From Tikrit, where she'd been ordered to disappear after a classified operation, where her existence had been officially erased, where coming back into the light meant risking everything. The tear hung for exactly 2 seconds before she wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Her voice came out quiet. Absolute. My son is graduating today, and I just finished a 16-hour shift saving lives. I'm staying. Sterling's mouth tightened. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper that only Hannah could hear, his jaw working like a muscle tensing under skin. I saw you in the parking lot. You heard things that aren't your concern. Leave now, or I'll make sure everyone knows you're trespassing. His hand moved to his radio, deliberate, a promise. He signaled the 2 security guards standing near the side exit, men with the kind of neutral expressions that came from training, from following orders without question. They approached from either side, their hands already reaching, already confident in their compliance. Their fingers found Hannah's arms just above the elbow, firm but not yet brutal, testing to see if she'd resist. She didn't. She stood. Hands at her sides. Composure like a stone wall. Sterling turned and walked toward the podium, his footsteps sharp on the tile. The principal was mid-sentence, something about academic achievement and bright futures, when Sterling raised his hand. The principal stopped. Everyone noticed. Sterling took the microphone, the action itself a small violence, a taking of power, and his voice rolled across the auditorium in measured, practiced tones. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to pause for just a moment. We have a security concern that requires immediate attention. Please remain calm while we address an unauthorized individual who refused to comply with our dress code. Every head turned. Every eye. The spotlight found the empty seat where Hannah had been sitting, and that empty seat became the most visible thing in the room. Families pointed. Children stared. A woman in the 3rd row raised her phone, the camera lens catching light like a weapon. Jacob stood up halfway, his face burning red, the color rising from his neck like a flame climbing a wall. He looked at his mother, then at the stage where the principal stood frozen, then back at his mother, caught between defending her and not destroying his own moment. His hands opened and closed at his sides. Around him, other parents touched his shoulders, pulling him back down. The message was clear. Sit. Stay. Don't make this worse. The guards gripped tighter now, their hesitation gone. They began walking Hannah toward the center aisle, and the auditorium became a corridor of judgment. Families physically leaned away from her as she passed, pulling their children closer as if she carried something contagious, something that might spread. One mother covered her daughter's eyes. Another father stood and applauded, slow, deliberate claps that echoed through the silence like an execution drum. Sterling followed behind them, speaking into his radio with the casual certainty of someone activating a network. Subject is being removed, proceeding to exit. His voice crackled back through speakers somewhere, acknowledged, confirmed, understood. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm overhead. One of them flickered, a nervous stutter of current. Hannah's hands remained at her sides, but inside her jacket, pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat, the faded unit patch sewn into the lining pressed back. A Navy SEAL trident, worn almost invisible by 17 years of service, by 3 combat deployments, by decisions made in darkness that changed lives. The patch was the only person in this room who knew who she really was. At the auditorium doors, Sterling was waiting. He held a sheet of paper, prepared, printed, ready for exactly this moment. Hannah realized with cold clarity that he'd planned this. That he'd never intended to let her stay. He read aloud to the growing crowd of observers gathering near the lobby, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. Hannah Clarke is hereby banned from all future school district events for disruption of a formal ceremony and refusal to comply with established dress code protocols. He walked to the bulletin board near the entrance and posted it with 2 thumbtacks, positioning it so her name in bold letters faced the hallway. A scarlet letter made of Times New Roman font. Sterling's phone was already at his ear before she'd even reached the parking lot. She heard him through the closing doors. Yes, I need police response for trespassing and possible assault. Yes, Sacred Heart Medical Center employee. No, I don't know her status, but she's creating a liability issue. He paused, listening. No, she's being removed now. Yes. Thank you. The line went dead. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. Hannah was 3 steps down the front hallway when the sound came from behind her, not a scream exactly, more like the sound of a body recognizing that something was fundamentally wrong. A man's wife, her voice climbing, "Help! Somebody help!" Hannah stopped. The guard stopped. Sterling stopped mid-stride, his phone still in his hand. The auditorium erupted into chaos, families standing, pushing toward the aisles, security guards freezing in confusion because this wasn't protocol, this wasn't something they'd trained for. Row 3. A man in his 50s, gripping his chest, his face going the color of wet concrete. His body collapsed sideways into his wife's lap, his breathing rapid and shallow, asymmetric. His left side moving. His right side not moving at all. Hannah's eyes clicked into a different focus, the kind of focus that came from combat trauma, from 18 years of reading bodies like other people read newspapers. Tension pneumothorax. Air collapsing the lung, crushing the heart, turning a breathing body into a dying one in minutes. Maybe less. She moved without deciding to move. Her body simply understood what needed to happen. The guard's grip loosened, confusion was stronger than protocol. Hannah broke free with one sharp movement, the kind of movement that comes from muscle memory, from drills repeated 10,000 times, and she reached the man in 8 seconds flat. She dropped to her knees beside him, and her hands moved like they were still in Tikrit, like they were still in that surgical tent at FOB Shank, like they'd never stopped moving. She ripped open his shirt. The buttons scattered across the tile floor like dice. Her fingers found his trachea, it deviated, shifted to the right, the classic presentation burning in her muscle memory like a branded mark. Her voice came out different now. Not quiet. Not deferential. A command structure written in human speech. You, call 911, tell them tension pneumothorax, patient needs transport now. You, find me a pen, any pen, ballpoint, needs a hollow tube. Move. Her voice was like a tank idling in a garage, steady, powerful, something that made people understand that movement was the only option. A stunned parent handed her a pen. Black plastic, just broken free from someone's hand. Hannah disassembled it in 3 seconds, cap, barrel, ink cartridge discarded, leaving the hollow tube. She used her car keys to mark the spot, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Her fingers were ice. Her breath was controlled. This was not emergency anymore. This was work. The man's wife was sobbing, her hands gripping his arm like it was the last thing keeping him tethered to the world. Hannah's voice cut through the noise, hold his hand and don't let go. He's going to come back. She performed the needle decompression, pressing the pen tube through skin and fascia and pleura, the decisive moment of pressure giving way to release. The hiss of escaping air was audible to everyone within 6 feet. The man's color improved. His breathing eased. The left side of his chest began moving again, synchronized, balanced. The crowd gasped like one organism. Sterling's face went white, not pale, white, like someone had drained the blood from his skull. This wasn't compliance. This was the opposite of compliance. This was visibility. This was a grandmother in a graduation auditorium recognizing the hands that had saved her grandson in a hospital hallway 3 months ago. This was everything Sterling needed to prevent, and it was happening in front of 200 witnesses with phones. He was on his phone before the hiss of air had even stopped echoing. His voice was different now, sharp, controlled, the voice of someone activating emergency protocols. I need the school board president, the city events coordinator, and legal counsel. Now. We have liability exposure. Yes. No. Do not let this woman leave the building. I'm calling police. He ended the call and made another one immediately. Then another. The network, spinning to life. The machinery of institutions, grinding toward neutrality, toward protection, toward the kind of power that comes from knowing the right people in the right places at the right time. Hannah's hands were still steady. Her breathing had not changed. But inside her jacket, against her ribs, the faded unit patch pressed harder, as if it too knew that the quiet part was over. That things were about to become very visible, very fast. The man in the third row never saw it coming. One moment he was watching his daughter walk across the stage, his arm around his wife's shoulders, and the next moment his chest tightened like someone had wrapped steel cables around his ribs. He gasped. His hand flew to his left side. His wife looked at him, and in that single second she knew something had broken inside him, something fundamental and irreversible. He collapsed into her lap. His lips turned blue-gray. Not the pale blue of cold hands or a long day at the office. The blue of oxygen starvation, of air moving the wrong direction through his body. His breathing came in rapid, shallow pulls, 30 breaths a minute, then 40. His wife screamed. Not words, just sound, the primal frequency of someone watching their partner suffocate while sitting in a folding chair at a high school graduation. The room froze. 200 people in formal dress suddenly stopped existing as individuals and became a single organism of shock. Parents grabbed their phones. Children asked what was wrong. The valedictorian paused mid-sentence at the podium, her voice trailing away as everyone's attention snapped backward like a rubber band released. Hannah was halfway down the aisle when she heard his wife scream. She didn't run. Running was for people who weren't certain. Her body simply moved toward crisis the way water moves downhill, no decision, no hesitation, just physics. The guard's hands had released her the moment she'd twisted her shoulders with the specific mechanics of someone who'd been trained to escape restraints. Their grip had been institutional and careless. Hers had been military. The man was drowning in air. That was the diagnosis she registered in the 1.3 seconds it took her to reach him. Drowning. His oxygen sat was probably in the 60s, maybe lower. His trachea was deviating. His jugular veins were distended like rope. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural space with nowhere to go, compressing his lungs, collapsing his superior vena cava, pushing his heart sideways in his chest. In 4 minutes, his blood pressure would flatline. In 5, he'd be dead. She knelt beside the wife's knees and placed her fingers on his neck. The carotid pulse was thready and rapid, 160 beats per minute, racing like a bird's heart. His skin was clammy, sweating through his dress shirt. She could smell the copper of adrenaline in his sweat, the sharp tang of fear-induced cortisol burning through his system faster than his body could metabolize it. "I need a ballpoint pen," Hannah said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The entire auditorium had gone so quiet you could hear the rain outside hammering the building's eastern wall like applause from an angry crowd. Pen. Now. Anyone. A parent in the 4th row, a woman in a blue dress, fumbled for her purse with shaking hands. Hannah held out her palm without looking away from the man's face. The pen landed in her hand like a gift. She didn't explain. Explanations were for later, for the people who would write reports and fill out incident forms and try to quantify what they'd witnessed. Right now, there was only the work. She unbuttoned the man's shirt with her left hand while her right hand positioned the pen. The clothing fell away. His chest was pale, unmarked, the chest of someone who'd spent his life in air-conditioned offices. Above his left collarbone, his skin rose and fell with the desperate rhythm of an animal in a trap. She found the second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The textbook location. But there was no textbook here, no sterile field, no anesthesia. There was only a man whose brain was being starved of oxygen in a graduation auditorium while his daughter watched from the wings. Hannah's hands moved on their own. Muscle memory. 14 years of field medicine in Tikrit, in bases where the operating theatre was a concrete room and the anesthesia was adrenaline and the fall-line was whatever you could find. Her hands knew this landscape better than they knew Houston, better than they knew the safe world people built when they weren't thinking about trauma. She drove the pen through his skin. There was resistance, the fascia beneath the dermis, the muscles of the intercostal space. Then it released. Air came with it. Not a hiss. A rush. The sound of pressurized space equalizing, of his collapsed lung re-expanding like a balloon inflating. The monitor someone had wheeled over, a nurse from the auditorium's first aid station, smart enough to grab equipment and run, suddenly showed oxygen saturation beginning to climb. 75. 80. 88. His breathing slowed from that frantic hyperventilation to something approximating normal. His wife was sobbing, her hand gripping Hannah's shoulder hard enough to leave marks. The daughter on the stage had her hand over her mouth. And Hannah kept her fingers on the pen, keeping the needle patent, keeping the air flowing out and not back in, buying time for the ambulance that should be 90 seconds away. The sirens arrived exactly 94 seconds later. The sound of them cut through the rain like a knife, and paramedics in dark uniforms came through the auditorium doors with the controlled efficiency of people trained for exactly this moment. They didn't ask questions. They saw the pen. They saw the oxygen saturation climbing on the monitor. They saw a woman with her hand steady on a needle and her jaw set like someone who'd done this in worse circumstances than a graduation ceremony. "Tension pneumo," Hannah said. Her voice was flat, informational. The voice of someone reporting status, not someone asking permission. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. O2 sat was in the 60s, now climbing. Initiated decompression 2 minutes ago. Patient's breathing stabilized. No prior medical history documented. He collapsed rapidly. The paramedics loaded the man onto their stretcher with the same lack of drama. One of them, a black paramedic with the call sign M. Martinez stitched on his uniform, looked at Hannah with something like recognition in his eyes. Not of her face. Of her competence. The kind of recognition that happens when a trained person watches another trained person work. "You're military," he said. It wasn't a question. "I just finished a 16-hour shift," Hannah replied. She was already stepping back, already giving them space. Already becoming invisible again. Muscle memory took over. The paramedics wheeled the patient toward the doors. The wife followed, still sobbing. The daughter jumped down from the stage in her graduation gown, ignoring the ceremony director's gestures to remain in position. Within 60 seconds, the ambulance had pulled away into the rain, its lights fading toward Sacred Heart Medical Center across the river. The auditorium was still completely silent. Dr. Sterling stood at the back of the room, watching the ambulance disappear. His hands were clenched at his sides. Hannah could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid mental inventory of every angle he needed to cover, every institutional power he needed to activate, every connection he needed to weaponize. He'd just watched her perform emergency medicine in front of 200 witnesses. He'd just watched her save a man's life in the exact moment he'd arranged for her removal. He reached for his phone. 20 minutes later, as the graduation ceremony was concluding, Jacob accepted his diploma to thunderous applause that felt wrong, celebratory, like everyone was trying to pretend the last hour hadn't happened, Dr. Sterling had the school board president on speakerphone in his private office, the district's insurance attorney reviewing liability claims, and the city events coordinator threatening to pull the venue's permit for future ceremonies. The network, once activated, moved with the smooth efficiency of institutional power protecting itself. He met the responding police officers at the entrance before they even reached Hannah. She was standing near the auditorium doors, still in her hospital scrubs, her hands empty. He presented them with a folder, printed and organized and prepared with the meticulous attention to detail that made him dangerous. That woman practiced medicine without a license on school property, Sterling said, his voice carrying the practiced concern of someone who'd rehearsed this speech. She performed an invasive procedure without patient consent. She physically assaulted security personnel when they attempted to stop her from disrupting this event. The officers looked at Hannah. Then they looked at Sterling. Then they looked at Hannah again. I want to be very clear about the sequence of events, Sterling continued. She was removed from this facility because she violated dress code policy. She then assaulted my security staff. When we moved to restrain her, she broke free and approached this man without any medical authorization. Everything documented. He handed them the folder. Timestamps. Witness statements. A fabricated prior complaint from an event she'd never attended. A physician's assessment, forged, but with his signature, suggesting she had a history of unauthorized medical practice. The paper trail was immaculate. The lies were buried under professional language and official letterhead. The officers read through the documents. Hannah watched their faces shift. The hesitation dissolved into certainty. The doubt became procedure. We're going to need you to come with us, one of them said. Jacob pushed through the crowd of graduates, his diploma still in his hand, his graduation gown still on his shoulders. His face was red, his voice loud enough to echo through the auditorium. She saved his life. You're arresting her for saving someone. Sterling placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder, his touch gentle, his expression one of profound sympathy. The gesture of a mentor toward a misguided youth. Son, your mother broke multiple laws. I understand your emotional reaction, but this is a learning moment about consequences. Rules exist for a reason. Boundaries exist for a reason. Even when our intentions are good, we have to respect institutional protocols. The words landed the way Sterling intended them to land. Jacob's face crumpled. Not with anger but with confusion. The moment of clarity, where his mother had moved with the focused competence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, was being reframed as transgression. As recklessness. As violation. Hannah didn't look at her son. She held out her wrists to the officers with the same composure she'd maintained in the auditorium. No resistance. No explanation. No plea. The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound like a rifle safety engaging, and she let them guide her toward the patrol car parked outside. Sterling approached the paramedics as they were finishing their report, pulling them aside with the ease of someone accustomed to privacy and deference. His voice stayed low, conversational, the tone of a colleague sharing important information. I should probably mention that woman performed an unauthorized medical procedure without licensing documentation, he said quietly. I'm not making accusations, but your report might need to reference the unusual nature of the intervention. The hospital district might want to investigate whether she actually has credentials to be practicing emergency medicine. The paramedics exchanged glances. One of them, E. Martinez, looked like he wanted to argue. But he'd already filled out half his report. Changing it now meant complications. Meant explaining to superiors why he was contradicting a physician. Meant becoming the problem instead of the solution. Sterling was 3 steps ahead. Always 3 steps ahead. 3 days later, Hannah sat in a waiting room at Sacred Heart VA Hospital, the same building where she should have been celebrated by now. Should have been processed through legal systems that would eventually recognize what she'd done. Should have been something other than a patient seeking psychiatric counseling after her own arrest and bail hearing. The waiting room smelled like industrial carpet and floor wax and the faint antiseptic tang she'd come to associate with government buildings. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the white noise of institutional indifference. Around her sat veterans. A man missing his left arm, staring at nothing. A woman with scars along her neck, filling out intake forms with trembling hands. An older man whose hands shook so badly he could barely hold a pen, Parkinson's maybe, or just the tremor of someone whose nervous system had been recalibrated by too many explosions. Some of these faces were familiar. Not by name, but by the geography of their trauma. She'd treated the man with a missing arm in Tikrit, 2009. IED. Compound fracture of the humerus with vascular damage. She'd packed the stump and gotten him on a medevac bird before hemorrhagic shock could finish what the explosion had started. He'd made it to Landstuhl. Made it home. Made it to this waiting room where he didn't recognize the woman filling out her own intake forms on the bench beside him. Just another face. Just another person carrying the weight of invisible wounds. Hannah checked the box next to suicidal ideation, past. Not present. Past. But the distinction felt rhetorical. She'd survived Tikrit. She'd survived 14 years of being invisible. She'd survived her son's graduation and the collapse in the auditorium and the handcuffs and the bail hearing where Dr. Sterling had testified that her medical intervention was reckless endangerment despite the paramedics' own documentation that the patient would have died without it. She'd survived all of it. But surviving wasn't the same as living. Above the intake desk hung a poster showing military ranks and insignia. She'd seen this poster 100 times in 100 VA facilities. Navy ranks laid out from recruit to admiral. And there, 2/3 of the way up, senior chief petty officer. The anchor insignia. The rating badge that had defined her for 14 years of her life, that had meant authority and responsibility and the burden of keeping people alive in the worst circumstances humans could engineer. Her eyes lingered on it. She'd earned that rank by keeping people alive. She'd lost it by keeping someone alive. And no one in this waiting room, not the man with one arm, not the trembling woman, not the intake nurse processing her paperwork, had any idea who was sitting on their bench. She stared at the poster and waited for her name to be called, and in that moment, the rain outside the windows hammered against the glass like it was trying to break through, like it was trying to get someone's attention, like it had something important to say. But the waiting room stayed silent except for the fluorescent hum. The handcuffs bit into Hannah's wrists as the officers led her toward the exit, their boots echoing against the polished floors of the Houston Convention Center, now transformed into something that felt less like a celebration and more like a crime scene. Dr. Sterling stood near the entrance, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in clipped sentences to someone on the other end. Yes, practicing medicine without a license on school property. An assault. 2 counts. His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who'd spent years weaponizing institutional power, who understood that paperwork could destroy as effectively as any blade. Behind him, his legal team assembled like vultures, exchanging glances that suggested they'd done this before, buried inconvenient people in red tape and charges that would take months to unravel. Hannah said nothing. She never did. The paramedics wheeled the collapsed man toward the ambulance bay at the adjacent Sacred Heart Hospital, their movements brisk and practiced, oxygen flowing, vitals climbing. 72. 80. 88. The man's eyes fluttered behind closed lids, somewhere between unconsciousness and the fragile space where bodies begin to remember how to function. Outside the hospital's glass doors, police cars waited with their lights strobing red and blue against the evening sky. 2 officers gripped Hannah's arms, not roughly, but with the unmistakable firmness of men following orders they didn't entirely understand. What they didn't understand was that her hands were trembling, but not from fear. The trembling came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that 7 years of civilian life hadn't quite buried. Her hands remembered Tikrit. They remembered the weight of her call sign. They remembered the orders that had unmade her. The memory hit like a concussion blast. August 2016. A compound in Tikrit's Jolan district. The operation had gone sideways in the way that only classified missions do, the kind that never appeared in official reports, the kind that got filed under need to know and buried under 3 layers of redaction. Hannah's team, 7 operators, all of them carrying shrapnel and blood loss and the particular kind of trauma that comes from being pinned down by sustained fire in a structure designed for defense. She'd held a compromised position for 6 hours. 6 hours of applying tourniquets with one hand while returning fire with the other. 6 hours of field surgery performed on a concrete floor while rounds punched through the walls like angry wasps. The fourth operator had a chest wound that would have killed him without a needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She'd used an IV catheter and whatever steadiness her hands possessed. The operation's outcome had been classified so high that even now, 7 years later, the details remained compartmentalized in her memory like a locked vault. But the price had been clear: disappear. Your records are erased. Your service is denied. You were never there. There was no operation. There is no you. Resurfacing would compromise the mission. Resurfacing would mean questions. Resurfacing would mean people would ask why a Navy SEAL had been ordered to vanish, why the Pentagon preferred the world believe she'd never existed at all. The officers placed her in the patrol car. Through the window, she could see Sterling still on his phone, his jaw set with the kind of grim satisfaction that came from knowing you'd just set something irreversible in motion. 3 days later, Hannah sat in a waiting room at the VA hospital in Houston, surrounded by the fluorescent hum of lights and the quiet desperation of people who'd given everything and weren't sure what they had left. The walls were painted a color that was supposed to be calming but mostly just looked tired. Across from her sat a man with one prosthetic leg, his prosthetic clad in a running shoe that would never run. Next to him, a woman with her arm in a sling, her hand trembling slightly as she filled out intake forms. And 2 seats down, a young Marine, maybe 19, staring at nothing with the particular 1,000-yard stare that came from having seen something the body couldn't forget. She'd treated that young Marine in Tikrit. She knew his name. She knew his rank. She knew he'd lost his squad mate and that the weight of survivor's guilt had pressed so hard on his chest that he'd attempted to suffocate it 3 times in the past year. But when his eyes passed over her, they registered nothing. No recognition. No memory of the woman who'd held his hand during a field transfusion while his buddy flatlined on a surgical table that used to be someone's dining room. She was invisible again. That was the point. That was always the point. The paramedics wheeled the collapsed man, Lieutenant Commander David Ross, though the paramedics didn't know that yet, through the ambulance bay at Sacred Heart, his vitals climbing, his consciousness returning in fragments. First came the sensation of pressure. Then came the awareness of movement. Then came the ability to think in complete sentences instead of disconnected images. His eyes opened. The ceiling tiles passed overhead. The paramedic's voice spoke into a radio, vital stable. Patient responding to stimuli. ETA 10 minutes. David Ross had been a SEAL team leader for 14 years. His training meant that even in recovery, even medicated and woozy, even coming back from the edge of cardiac collapse, his brain was cataloging details. Location. Personnel. Time of day. Exit routes. Threat assessment. The woman who'd saved his life. The call sign she'd whispered when she performed that impossible needle decompression with a pen from a parent's pocket. Valkyrie. He'd only heard that call sign once, 7 years ago, in a classified briefing about a classified operation that had been so classified that he'd been told to erase it from his memory the moment he left the room. But call signs don't erase. They're burned into the brain like call marks on a rifle stock. He'd watched her work that day. Watched her move through fire like it wasn't there. Watched her save 3 operators when everyone agreed they were already gone. And then she'd simply vanished. Disappeared. The briefing officer had explained it with the kind of clinical distance that only comes from reading from official paperwork. Senior Chief Clarke has been reassigned. Her records are sealed. This operation never happened. You will speak of it to no one. The stretcher turned a corner. Through the window, he saw the police station adjacent to the hospital. And through the glass doors of that station, he saw a woman in handcuffs being led past the desk, her hospital scrub still rumpled from the graduation, her face wearing the particular composure that only came from having already survived the worst. Ross pulled his own full line with enough force that the alarm started screaming. The paramedic shouted. Ross didn't hear him. He was already sitting up, already speaking with the kind of absolute authority that comes from someone who'd commanded men in the dark, "Stop this stretcher. Now!" The paramedic tried to push him back down. Ross's hand was steady as a surgical laser as he pointed directly at the police station window. "That woman. I need to speak to her. Right now." "Sir, you just collapsed. You need. I'm Navy SEAL. What I need is to speak to that woman before you finish processing her." His voice dropped an octave. "This isn't a request." The paramedic, recognizing the particular cadence of someone trained to lead, abandoned the ambulance route entirely and wheeled the stretcher toward the police station entrance. The automatic doors hissed open. The lobby fell silent like someone had hit a mute button. Hannah's eyes met Ross's eyes across 15 feet of linoleum and institutional silence. His lips moved. She read them before he spoke, "Valkyrie." The word struck her like a physical blow. 7 years. 7 years of silence and erasure and pretending to be someone else, and suddenly the past was lying on a stretcher with a hospital gown and an full line, and it remembered her. Her hands trembled. She let them. Jacob pushed through the crowd near the auditorium entrance, his graduation gown still creased from where he'd been standing when his mother saved a stranger's life. He'd followed the ambulance. He'd watched his mother being arrested. He'd watched her hands move with a precision and authority that he'd never seen before, like they belonged to someone else entirely, someone his mother had been hiding. He walked to the police station window and saw her in handcuffs, and something in his chest broke open. The stretcher was parked in the station lobby now. Ross was sitting up, his eyes locked on Hannah's. When he spoke, his voice carried into every corner of the space, Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. "Navy SEAL. That's who you are, isn't it?" Jacob's world tilted. He pushed through the station doors into the lobby. His voice, when he found it, was barely his own, that Senior Chief Petty Officer Clarke. He said it like he was introducing her to the world. Like he was introducing himself to his own mother. Hannah closed her eyes. Inside her jacket lining, the faded unit patch, the SEAL trident worn soft by 7 years of proximity to her ribs, suddenly felt like the only real thing she'd ever owned. Everything else had been a performance. Everything else had been a necessary lie. But the patch was real. And her son had just spoken her rank in a police station lobby, and a Navy SEAL lieutenant commander was refusing to be taken to surgery until he explained who she was. The officers looked confused. One of them moved to remove her handcuffs. The senior officer at the desk reached for his computer. Sterling, who'd been watching from the corner with his legal team, took a step backward. His phone buzzed. Then again. Then again. Messages arriving like rounds from a sniper's rifle, each one a piece of his network collapsing, a favor caller deciding it was time to distance himself, a board member suddenly very interested in reviewing contract reconciliations. The doors of the police station opened again. The sound was like a rifle being chambered. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. 20 Navy SEALs in dress uniforms entered the lobby in a formation so tight and precise that it made the air pressure change. They arranged themselves in a half-circle around Hannah and her son, a physical statement that needed no interpretation. The most senior officer, Captain Michael Torres, with the kind of bearing that only comes from having commanded combat operations across 3 continents, walked directly to the desk sergeant. His voice was quiet. It was also something else entirely. "We're here for Senior Chief Petty Officer Clarke. She's being released into military custody." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Halfway down the aisle, Jacob pushed through the crowd in his graduation gown, his voice cutting through the murmur of confused onlookers. "That Senior Chief Petty Officer Clarke." The words landed like a defibrillator shock. Hannah's trembling hands, not from fear, but from the weight of truth finally surfacing, reached into her jacket lining. Her fingers found the edge of the patch she'd sewn there 7 years ago, the one she'd touched 1,000 times in empty parking lots and hospital supply closets. She pulled it free. The faded Navy SEAL trident caught the auditorium lights, unmistakable. The patch trembled in her palm as she held it up. Not her hand shaking now. The truth shaking. The man on the stretcher, the one whose lips had turned blue just minutes earlier, the one whose pneumothorax she'd decompressed with a ballpoint pen and her muscle memory, sat up on his elbows. Lieutenant Commander David Ross. His voice, hoarse but certain, carried across 200 shocked faces, Silver Star. He paused. The crowd held its breath. Bronze Star with Valor. Another pause, longer this time. His eyes locked on Hannah's. 2 purple hearts. No one moved. No one breathed. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric hymn. 3 combat deployments, Ross continued, each word a hammer strike against silence. Tikrit. All of them. She saved 17 operators under fire. 17. I watched her work. I watched her choose lives over protocol, duty over self-preservation. He looked at the school board members, at the police officers, at Sterling's face going from white to something beyond red. Senior Chief Clarke isn't a nurse pretending to be military. She's a warrior who became a nurse because that's what warriors do when the war ends and the healing begins. The 20 SEALs in dress uniforms shifted forward in unison. Not threatening. Bearing witness. 2 figures emerged from the back of the auditorium then, not police, but the kind of authority that moved differently. Federal credentials catching light as they approached. Special Agents Chen and Rodriguez. The FBI had been quietly investigating Sterling's vendor fraud scheme for 4 months. $2.3 million in kickbacks from inflated catering and security contracts. They'd had warrants since March. They'd been waiting for an opening, documentation, evidence that tied the paper trail directly to Sterling's decision-making. What they found instead was a gift. Agent Chen's voice was quiet, professional, lethal. Dr. Sterling, would like to discuss your financial arrangements with Prestige Events Catering and Summit Security Services. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room had already gone silent. Sterling's lawyer set his briefcase down carefully. Not opening it. Closing. I'm going to need a moment with my client. Actually, you need a different attorney. This is beyond my scope. The school board president's voice came through a phone someone was holding up, speaker active. The board was unaware of any financial irregularities and will cooperate fully with the investigation. Sterling's face cycled through colors, white, purple, a furious red that looked like blood pressure spiking towards stroke territory. He tried to speak, words failing, then, I don't know what she told you, but she's a disgruntled parent with a grudge. Agent Rodriguez held up a document. She didn't tell us anything. We've had warrants since March. But we're curious about these documents you filed today. She moved closer. You claimed Hannah Clarke had prior complaints. Prior arrests. Prior incidents. We ran her name through federal databases. These documents are fabricated. That's felony forgery. That's filing a false police report. That's witness intimidation. The room had stopped being a graduation auditorium. It had become a courtroom. Sterling's desperation shifted into something uglier, a man watching his constructed world collapse in real time. His network of favors meant nothing to federal agents. His institutional position meant nothing when the institution was about to investigate how deep his corruption ran. He turned on Hannah with pure venom, his voice cracking, "You ruined this. You heard me in the parking lot and you couldn't just mind your business. I built something here." Hannah took one measured breath. Her eyes were steady. Her voice, when it came, was the voice of someone who'd made peace with loss long before this moment. I was minding my business. I was saving lives. You were stealing from children's education. Sterling lunged toward her verbally, screaming about fraud, about lies, about her pretending to be something she wasn't. His voice rose and fractured. She's a criminal. She's been hiding, lying about her service. She's everything I said she was. The 20 seals shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough that everyone in that auditorium understood what happened next would be a choice, Sterling's choice. Walk back. Or learn what happens when you threaten someone surrounded by people who've made a career out of making threats irrelevant. Torres's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through water. Step back. Now. Sterling stepped back. Agent Rodriguez continued, her tone unchanged by the verbal explosion. In the past 4 hours, you attempted to forge Hannah Clarke's medical records. You contacted Sacred Heart Hospital under false pretenses, trying to have her nursing license reviewed based on documentation you knew was fabricated. You created false disciplinary reports. You contacted the police department with forged criminal history. She closed a folder. Each action. Each call. Each email. Monitored by federal investigators. She smiled, and it wasn't kind. We were building a fraud case. You just accelerated your own sentencing. The handcuffs gleaming under fluorescent lights. Cameras flashing, parents recording his perp walk through the police station lobby, past the same families who'd watched Hannah escorted out of the graduation ceremony. Sterling's expensive suit was wrinkled now, stained with sweat. His network of carefully cultivated favors had evaporated the moment the FBI's authority entered the room. Everything he'd built on lies and intimidation collapsed in exactly the amount of time it took for one wounded SEAL to sit up and say her name. 1 year later, Hannah stood on a stage at the Houston Naval Reserve Center in her Navy dress whites, the insignia of Senior Chief Petty Officer restored to her sleeves where it belonged. The ceremony hall was full, families, SEALs, the commanding officers who'd spent the past 12 months fighting DOD bureaucracy to unseal her classified records, to partially declassify the operation that had stolen her identity. The order had come through 3 weeks ago. She was authorized to serve publicly now. Authorized to be seen. Jacob stood beside her in his Navy boot camp uniform, delayed entry processing complete, on his way to become a hospital corpsman. Following his mother's legacy. Following the woman he'd watched sacrifice everything, including her own name, for the kind of honor that doesn't fit on business cards. Lieutenant Commander Ross pinned new insignia on both their uniforms at the joint ceremony. His hands were steady. His voice carried, I was there when Senior Chief Clarke did impossible things. I watched her choose duty when no one was watching. I watched her save lives when saving them cost her everything. He looked at Jacob. I watched her raise a son who inherited that same kind of courage. Captain Torres read the citation that reinstated Hannah's honors and authorized her service as a SEAL community advocate and trainer. The 20 SEALs who'd arrived at that police station 1 year ago filled the front row, dress uniforms impeccable, eyes forward. A new segment played on a monitor as the ceremony continued. Sterling's fraud trial had resulted in 8 years federal prison and $2.3 million restitution. After serving 18 months on good behavior, he was released. Current footage showed him teaching CPR at a Houston community college for minimum wage, his expensive suits replaced by an ill-fitting polo shirt, his corner office replaced by a prefab classroom. A student asked about his background. He changed the subject. His voice, in the video, sounded like something trying to stay quiet. Hannah stood at a podium later, addressing new SEAL medic candidates. She held the faded unit patch, now framed in glass, worn edges visible. For 7 years, I couldn't tell my son who I was. I couldn't wear this uniform. I couldn't serve in the light. But when that man collapsed, I had a choice, stay hidden or stay true. Her eyes moved across the room. Across Jacob. Across Ross. Across the SEALs who came for her. There's a saying my team leader told me in Tikrit, true class is what you do when the lights go out. She set the patch down carefully. The lights came back on. And I'd make the same choice every time. Hannah and Jacob walked out of the ceremony together, both in uniform, sunlight streaming through the doors. Her hands were steady now, not trembling, not from fear or restraint, just steady. The same hands that had held lives together in operating rooms and parking lots and graduation ceremonies. the same hands that had finally stopped hiding. This is the moment invisible veterans need to see, that your service doesn't stop mattering just because the world forgot you. That coming back into the light doesn't require permission from anyone but yourself. If you're watching this and you've carried a hidden identity, a classified truth, a service no one knows about, this is your sign. Tell your story. Claim your name. The right people will recognize you. And if you know someone carrying that weight, be the person who stands up and says their rank out loud. Subscribe for more stories of warriors who waited for their moment. Like this video if you believe in honoring the ones who serve in silence. Comment below, what would you do if the person you underestimated turned out to be a legend? And remember, heroes don't always look like heroes. Sometimes they look like the nurse in scrubs standing at the back of the room.